All right, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the Israeli lobbying groups here in Australia and over in the US, because apparently there's a massive conglomerate of people here in Australia that seem to think that AJAC, which is the Australian equivalent of APAC, they seem to think that AJAC has a lot more swaying power to our politicians. And there's one guy in particular that I watched that I saw his video about this, and I had to say something about it because it is quite concerning when I start seeing people that don't really tell the whole story or the whole truth. And his very thing is bring back common sense, but this wasn't really much of a common sense kind of take or approach. And let me just preface this by saying that I like this guy. I usually enjoy all of his content, and this is not to start a fight or a war in this sense at all. In fact, I want to prop up a lot of his content, and the whole purpose of this is to make him think a little bit more about AJAC or about the Israeli lobbying groups or about our politicians, because he doesn't like our Bo, which I don't either, and I don't like Susan Ley either. So, and he's mentioning both in this video, but it seems like it's very negative about AJAC, but he hasn't really spoken too much about the Islamic lobbying groups, which outnumber the Israeli ones. And if the Israeli ones really had an enormous amount of swaying power, like he was claiming in this video that you're about to watch, why is it that Albo still went ahead and recognized the Palestinian state? Why is it that you have lots of these issues, or they're letting in countless people from Gaza? Why is it that they're letting in so many Islamists? If the Israeli lobbying group had lots of power and lots of sway in our government, why haven't they done anything to really prop up the Israeli cause? Makes you think, makes you wonder, right? But nevertheless, have a watch of Sam Bamford of the Two Worlds Collide podcast talk about AJAC, the Australian equivalent of APAC, the Israeli lobbying group, in not a very good sort of sense. Now, yeah, just have a watch.
Australia, Israel and Jewish Affairs Council, AJAC, well, guess what they do? They're a political lobby group. Their whole job is to build relationships with Australian politicians, fly them over to Israel, show them their side of the story, and then potentially shape the way they talk when they get home. They're basically a small version of APAC, which is America Israel Public Affairs Committee. Right, and APAC, they're one of the most powerful lobby groups in America. They spend over $100 million at every single US election for candidates who back their agenda. And AJAC, which is Australia's version of APAC, well, they have the same playbook. And if you want proof of this, let's check out Susan Ley's story. Right, Susan Ley, she spent almost 20 years as the only right-leaning MP that was pro-Palestine. Right, let's check out her history. In 1960, she grew up in the UAE. In the early 2000s, she co-chaired Parliament of Friends to Palestine with Anthony Albanese. In 2008, she stood up and said Palestine has been wiped off the map. In 2011, she did a Palestine-funded trip to the West Bank and even ended up sponsoring a child in Bethlehem. And then in 2017, she publicly spoke out about the blockades in Gaza. And then in May 2022, well, she became the deputy leader of the Liberal Party. This is where it all changes. Then in October 2022, she went on the Ram Bam AJAC funded tour to Israel. Then in 2025, she becomes opposition leader. Right, and then Albanese comes out, recognizes a Palestine state. And after being on a board with Albanese for nearly 2 decades with the Friends of Palestine in Parliament, well, she writes to 25 Republicans over in America to try and block Albanese's stance on Palestine. What a backflip. Right, and then in September 2025, just recently, she comes out and gives a speech at an AJAC luncheon, which was pro-Israel. Right, now, I don't like Albanese, everyone knows that, but she stood next to him for 2 decades, and pushed the same pro-Palestine narrative with him. Then bang, she goes on a tour, wants to become leader of the Liberal Party, and her speech just changes overnight. Right, and here's the kicker. The Parliament Friends of Palestine group that she once co-chaired, well, it's now packed with MPs who have done the AJAC trip. Go figure. What's up with that? Now, it's not just politicians who take these trips. It's media, it's social media influencers, it's bureaucrats, and guess what? It's even candidates. Candidates who aren't even elected into parliament yet have done this trip. And yeah, sure, we have other political members go over to China, India, and all these other places, but Israel is the only one with a private lobby group in Australia where they fully fund trips. Now, I don't know if you pay attention to what's happening over in America, but a lot of the talk is AIPAC has that much influence over America that everyone is now calling them the United States of Israel. Since 2010, Ajax's Ram Bam tour, well, they've paid for over 100 MPs to go over there. Ajax's interest isn't to put Australia first, it's to put Israel first and then Australia second. So why do we let them lobby that way? Australia doesn't need politicians that run off foreign lobbying scripts. It needs politicians who work for Australia and Australia only. And until Australians come out and only preach Australia first, then guess what? None of them are fit for service. What's your thoughts?
I hate to break it to Sam, and I think he would know this considering that he has the Australia first approach, but I don't believe for one second that any politician, aside from a very select minority, like very, very select, I think you've got, Jacinta Price, for example, Pauline Hanson. I don't think many other of our MPs are actually Australia first. I think a lot of them have been bought and sold by some lobbying group. And what is interesting to me is that no one seems to really be talking about the Islamist lobbying groups. It's always about the AJAC or AIPAC, the Israeli ones, because apparently Israel is so powerful that it controls all of our MPs and tells our MPs what to do. Like, apparently Israel is super, super powerful in convincing our government on what to do, that they're allowing pro-Islamists into this country. That doesn't make much sense to me. Now, the whole Susan Ley story, saying that Susan Ley is someone that is on the right, is laughable. That is an actual joke to me because she ain't anywhere near the right at all. She doesn't espouse any of what I would consider conservative values or beliefs. And Sam, I think you should maybe correct that statement a little bit. I'll do it for you. But the AJAC lobbying group, the Ram Bam tour, right? So we can make this assumption, which is exactly what Sam's doing here. We can make this assumption that because Susan Ley, her entire story has been pro-Palestinian or the pro-Palestine cause, right? And she went on this Ram Bam tour. So after she went on this Ram Bam tour, funded by AJAC, the Israeli lobbying group, she's then had a change of tune. She went to the West Bank. She had a fully funded trip there. Okay, she didn't change her tune when she went there. That's interesting to me why she actually went to the West Bank and then decided to fund a child in Bethlehem. Fairly intriguing. Maybe we should do a little bit more digging into that side of the story, right? Was that funded by Islamists? Maybe. I wonder if it was. Then she goes over with the Israeli lobbying group to Israel and then has a change of heart. Now, while Sam said that these lobbying groups, they have the objective of trying to influence politicians to have sort of like an Israeli first narrative and then Australia second, I think all of these lobbying groups obviously want Australia to support them. I don't think that necessarily they're going to go, well, you must have, when it push comes to shove, even though you're living in Australia, you must have an Israeli first narrative. That is our prerogative. We're going to pay you to have an Israeli first narrative. But when it comes down to Australian issues, they have an Australian first agenda and narrative, do they not? But when it comes to Israeli narratives or things that are going on overseas, they're going, well, we're supporting Israel. But then apparently everyone's going, well, that's not Australia first, is it? Keeping in mind that Israel is our ally in the Middle East. They espouse the same values that we do. So evidently we need to be in partnership with Israel because it has a net positive benefit to Australians. It does not mean that we are Israeli first and Australian second. No, I would say that I'm Australian first, and I think we should put Australian interests definitely at the forefront, but also our allies' interests come into play, especially when our allies' interests are being, attacked, I guess you could say, by Islamists, by Hamas, by a pro-terrorist organization. Now, getting back to Susan Ley. Yes, she went over funded by AJAC, and she had a change of heart. You could also make the assumption that because she went over there, she saw the reality of what's actually happening in Israel and what's happening to the Israelis. And then she's gone, well, maybe I'm going to have a change of tune, a change of heart, and actually be on the side of Israel because maybe I shouldn't be supporting a pro-terrorist organization or regime. Maybe that would make a little bit more sense. Maybe she saw the October 7th clips. Maybe she saw that. I don't know. I wasn't there, but everyone's sort of going, well, it makes more sense that she was paid off. She's a politician after all. And yes, part of me is going, well, that's probably more than likely the case, considering all these other politicians, they're able to afford luxury houses. They're on massive incomes that most of it is paid for by Australians, but the lobbying groups get in. And I've always said that, I've been quite consistent on this. You don't get into politics nowadays to make much of a positive difference. You get into politics now for yourself and your own self-interest in basically pushing up your own coffers as high as you possibly can make it and not getting caught in the process. And the way you can do that is with lobbying groups. I'm going to throw my support here. Now, what Sam failed to mention, and yes, he did allude to it a little bit by saying you got lobbying groups from China, India, but he failed to mention the Islamist lobbying groups. Maybe he should have done that because guess what, ladies and gentlemen? Islamic lobbying groups here in Australia outnumber the Jewish ones. Key Muslim advocacy bodies, this is from Grok, by the way, include the Australian Federation of Islamic Councils and the Australian Muslim Advocacy Network, Alliance of Australian Muslims, and the grassroots groups like Muslim Votes Matter. Now, I think Albanese recognizing a Palestinian state makes a huge statement to all of us, does it not? We're going to reward terrorism. Now, Albo acted in his own self-centered interests, and it makes me wonder why. Could it be that he had Islamic lobbying groups in his ear? Could it be that Tony Burke, as well, letting in all of the pro-Gazan people or the Islamists that are coming from Gaza, letting them in, goodness knows how many? Could it be that the Islamic lobbying groups are getting in his ear as well and paying him off? Because, man, he showed up at Sydney Airport when they all arrived and he was greeting them. What foreign affairs minister does that, I wonder? Unless there is some kind of incentive for him to be there, why was he there? Makes you think, right? Now, Sam, you're all about common sense. I'm posing these common sense questions to you. If the Israeli lobbying group, AJAC, was so incredibly powerful, why didn't they put a stop to Tony Burke? Why didn't they go after Tony Burke and say, hey, Tony Burke, we're willing to offer you X amount of dollars not to show up the Sydney airport? Maybe they did. We don't know that. But I'm posing the question all the same. If they were so powerful, why haven't they done anything to stop all of the, what would appear to be the mass pro-Palestinian action groups or MPs? There are more MPs in our parliament that are siding with the pro-Palestinian cause than there are MPs that side with the Israeli cause. And you could also argue, oh, that's because the Israeli lobbying group haven't invited any of these pro-Palestinian ones, like they did with Susan Ley, over to Israel yet. Maybe they need to increase it, or maybe they have. Maybe they've tried. Now, I think the influencers or the politicians that have been overseas and gone to Israel, I don't think it's a bad thing to be invited over to the Holy Land and get to see Israel as a whole. I don't think that is a bad thing whatsoever. And if it's going to be funded and paid for by Israel, fantastic. What's so bad about having an Israeli group go, we want Australian MPs to experience what it's like in Israel for Jews? Man, as a Christian, I'm going, if I had an all expenses paid trip to Israel to walk where Jesus walked and experience the Holy Land, 100%. Doesn't mean that I'm going to be paid off to do it. And by the way, I'm not getting paid off by anyone, and I can prove that, like my bank statements and all that sort of other stuff. Um, I can show that I'm not being paid by anyone to say any of this. It's ridiculous to me how you've got all these people that somehow all of a sudden go after an Israeli lobbying group and say they're so all powerful and mighty because they seemingly changed Susan Lay's opinion on the pro-Palestine cause. That's just one example, right? Susan Lay, of all people. No. She wrote to 25 Republican politicians about the Australia's pro-Palestine recognition state, like that kind of nonsense. But the Israeli lobbying group weren't powerful enough to put a stop to it. So also, guys, just so you're aware of this, 60 Muslim groups backed the Islamic nurses. I don't know if you guys remember that said that they wanted to kill Jews in the hospital. 60 groups. And by the way, if the Israeli lobbying groups were so powerful and did control our politicians and did control majority of the police force or the judges, you name it, why didn't they get a harsher sentence? Why were they let off, pretty much? Why do they get such a reduced sentence? It's because of the Islamic lobbying groups, more or less. Because they put a great deal of pressure on the government, on the judges, on the police. It's the reason why the police launched this investigation. It took them so long because they didn't want to cause a stir. Now, if you want to go after the Israeli lobbying groups, let's have a look at this. Landmark report makes 54 recommendations to combat Islamophobia in Australia. Now the government must act. So, Sam, this whole rise of Islamophobia and what the government wants to do. Now, you can also make the same kind of argument, I guess you could say, about anti-Semitism. But anti-Semitism is rife in Australia. Islamophobia is a nonsensical term. You're saying to me that I have an irrational fear of Muslims. No, I have a perfectly rational fear of Islam. Thank you very much. Because what Islam preaches and teaches. Thank you very much. I don't have a concern in the world about having Jews in this country. I do have a concern, however, of Islamists in this country that teach from their mosques that I, myself, I am an infidel. I mean, you are an infidel, apparently, Sam, according to Muslims. So why don't you call them out? Why don't you bring attention to that? So if you wanted to have a fair and balanced approach to this lobbying group topic, which seems to be incredibly big, and I haven't touched it for a number of different reasons. Again, not because I'm being paid, but because everyone seems to make a mountain out of a molehill with these lobbying groups. Okay, politicians are bought and paid for. We can't do anything to stop it. We just can't. It's the way things go. But it doesn't mean that politicians are not being bought and paid for by the other side as well, by Islamists. And if you've got in Australia these landmark, reports and recommendations to combat Islamophobia, it doesn't seem like the Israeli lobbying group is doing a very good job, does it? It seems more like the Islamist lobbying group is doing a much better job with paying off these politicians. Otherwise, you wouldn't get all these laws protecting the Islamists. Otherwise, you'd have the other way around of, well, we're going to kick out the Islamists, not bring them in mass entries, and then protect them under these new Islamophobia laws. Islam is not a race. So why say, Islamophobia? Like, they're not a race. It's a death cult religion. It makes zero sense. So I just wanted to give this a fair and balanced approach, because also, ladies and gentlemen, why can't the Israeli lobbying group, AJAC, put a stop to something like this? The secret life of the alleged new face of Islamic terror who is accused of trying to recruit Aussie martyrs. This woman was trying to recruit terrorists in Australia, probably funded by Islamic groups. I don't know. I can't prove that. It's alleged. But if the Israeli lobbying group was so powerful, why can't they put a stop to all these things that are going on in our country? Because Tony Burke and a lot of other politicians are bringing these people in. What about the ISIS brides that were let in? How about them? The Israeli lobbying group couldn't put a stop to them, could they? So I don't think they're all powerful like you claim that they are. I don't think they control much, if anything at all. It seems like if you really want to look into how big everything is, I would encourage you to look at the religion of Islam. And I would encourage you to look at what our government is doing at the moment in defense, like what Keir Starmer is doing over in the UK. Maybe it may make a little bit more sense because Israel and the Jews are not our enemy. Maybe it's not wise to go after and ostracize and make them out to look like they're the big bad wolf in this equation. Like, oh, they paid for an all-expenses trip for Susan Lay. So what? For her to see, like, for many, many years, she's been on one particular side and then all of a sudden she's flipped. Maybe it's because she saw the truth. You ever thought of that? Like, I haven't been over there and I can already tell. It's because of who I listen to. People that actually have a great deal of common sense, first and foremost. They're smart. And to be fair, like, it worries me. It really does worry me how so many people are worried about lobbying groups that are Israeli rather than worrying about Islamic lobbying groups. So if you wanted to worry about both, great, fantastic. Then make a fair and balanced video on both. But you didn't. You wanted to go, well, our politicians need to be Australia first. But then you went after Israeli lobbying groups, AJAC. You can make the same argument and say Australians need to be Australia first and not go after, or they're not looking at the Islamic lobbying groups that are more than likely supporting them. Look at Australia's reaction to anti-Semitism versus their reaction to Islamists or Islam in general. Look at what happened in the UK. It may actually help you out a little bit. So once again, this is not to start a fight. I like a lot of his content. I just wanted to do a more fair and balanced approach. And when it comes to this, like, Australia first narrative, I think it is in Australia's best interest to be allied with Israel, not allied with Gaza or Palestinians. Hence why we have allyship. It's like the same thing with being an ally with, for example, New Zealand, or being an ally with America. It's like you can still be Australia first. Be like, for example, if America came over with their lobbying groups. So we could spend ages talking about this, but the fact of the matter remains, you can still be Australia first, but also support other countries and their causes because it aligns with yours. Just a thought. Anyway, if I'm wrong, let me know. You guys take care, be blessed, and I'll see you all in the next video.